guys, welcome to this presentation. My name is Don Corleon, and today we're going to talk about out-of-position turn strategies in 3-up pots as the PFR. So, what are we going to learn today? We're going to talk about concepts that are going to help us pick the best size in every spot. Now, that's a big task. It's not about being perfect. It's not about choosing the exact best sizing to the 1%. But we're going to talk about concepts that are going to help us navigate turns and pick roughly correct sizings depending on what inputs, the board, the SPR, and whatnot. We're going to try to learn how to stop getting in unnecessarily sticky situations. So in poker, there's times where you just can't help it but get into difficult spots with bluff catchers, zero EV hands, right? But there's a lot of times that newer players, less experienced players, will get into very, very tough spots with marginal hands that could have been avoided, right? And strong players tend to be very good at only getting in those sticky situations whenever it's appropriate. And they tend to basically realize their equity better overall. And like Mike Tyson said, we're going to try to have an impregnable defense. And we're going to try to not be afraid of facing bets, of check calling, check raising, etc. Lower stakes players tend to both be afraid of being in the defense mode, right? Lower stakes players tend to like being very aggressive in terms of, not overly aggressive, but tend to like having the initiative, right? Not stopping the betting lead and whatnot. And sometimes that's not correct. So we're going to try to not be afraid of getting into checking mode, and then, of course, not getting destroyed after checking, because that's also a problem that a lot of people have. Let's talk about the equity distribution. Your range has certain edges over your opponents and vice versa. What does this mean? Well, your range is going to have, even if you don't have an overall range advantage, even if your range has an overall lower equity, although it could have a higher equity, there are going to be certain portions of the range that are going to usually be peaks that are higher in abundance than your opponents. To give you a practical example, maybe your opponent has the nuts more often than you, but if you have the second nuts more often than your opponent, that is a certain edge that your range has, and there are ways to leverage that. We're going to talk about how your strategy is built around your unique hands. In this case, in 3-up pots out of position as the PFR, a lot of the time, although not always, but a lot of the time, your unique hands are over pairs, ace, king, these sort of hands. And what does that unique hand mean? Well, your range and your opponent's range are going to have a lot of similarities, right? You both are going to have overcards, suited broadways, some pockets like sevens and whatnot, some suited connectors, some hands like ace queen offsuit, ace jack offsuit, stuff like that is going to be shared by both ranges. But there's certain hands that your range has that your opponent either doesn't have or has much less of, right? And when that's the case, your strategy is built around those hands. Okay, why? When you have a shared hand, there's multiple ways in which you can achieve your goal, right? Because your opponent is also going to lead lines into what benefits that hand. But whenever you have hands that your opponent cannot have, you have the responsibility to take the hand into its proper line, so to speak. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but it kind of works like that. Okay. So usually your strategy is built around your unique hands that either you only can have or your opponent has a lot less of. And shared hands usually tag along. They don't call the shots, so to speak. Size is picked as a function of equity. So depending on how much equity and what those unique hands want to do, that's usually how you build your overall strategy. This is the board, 9-5-3 two-tone, small blind versus button 3-up pot. We bet 2/3 on flop, and an ace comes, offsuit ace, okay? we have four options, okay? What's our overall strategy going to be built around? Is it going to be a range check? Is it going to be a small size, 25%, maybe a third? It's not about the exact size. 50% or 3/4? The answer is it's 25%. Okay. Now, if you think about what I just said in the previous slide, our range, our strategy is built around our unique hands. Okay, what are our unique hands here? Well, yes, we do have maybe a little bit more of an ace king and whatnot, but really what we have a lot of that our opponent doesn't, when we bet big on flop, right? When we bet big on flop, we're saying we do have something like tens through kings a lot of the time, right? That's what we're saying with our bet. And so that's our quote unquote unique, not so much unique, but our protagonist hand, if you will. And those hands, when an ace comes, they actually want to generally bet small because our opponent is not going to have a lot of random ace-x calling the flop. Another protagonist hand that I missed is low ace-x, right? We're going to bet the flop with some ace-6 with a backdoor type of stuff. And a lot of those hands, our opponent is just going to fold flop versus a huge bet. Okay, so we have more ace-x, but not strong ace-x so much, but weaker ace-x, right? Because our opponent is going to actually call the flop with ace-king, ace-queen very often. So our bracket of quote-unquote unique hands goes from weak ace-x to like jacks or so. So here we are. As you can see on flop, our range is built very much around these overpairs, right? And we have some hands like, as I said, ace-6 of diamonds, ace-7 of diamonds, ace-8 of diamonds, right? Hands like that our opponent is going to, a lot of them just fold, right? Ace-6 of diamonds just folds. Yes, he's going to have some gut shots, of course, but we're going to have more of those weaker ace-x. He is going to defend ace-king, ace-queen relatively often, and he is going to raise the flop a lot with these overpairs that he didn't even have that much from pre-flop. Okay, so as we can see, those are going to be our hands that are carried to the river, to the turn, sorry, that our opponent is going to have a lot less of. So as we can see, when I click on the ace, it comes out as a 25% sizing strategy, right? If we look at the ranges, we can see this little graph right here. We are the small blind, we are the yellow line, and we see that our advantage lies in a very specific part of the range, right? We actually have a equity, if you will, disadvantage. We have our range has overall less equity because of the filtering effect in our opponent's range when we bet really big, right? But there's a certain portion, a very specific portion of hands where we have an advantage, where we have that specific edge, right? And that goes from, a strong 9, because, by the way, our opponent is also going to raise some 9x and just show off some, or raise small with some 9x on flop. And we have, more 10s, more jacks, etc. And queens, kings, right? So that's what our strategy is built around. Those used to be overpairs that now are underpairs. We see there's quite a big peak here. Well, we're going to talk later about peaks and valleys, right? When I in the future in this session, when I say peak, I mean this kind of thing, and when I say valley, I mean this kind of thing, right? In this case, our peak is our opponent's valley. So what we can see is that we're betting a lot. And some people wouldn't expect this. Some people would just assume that when the ace comes, they just have to check with these underpairs because, you just lose to an ace. There's so many ace-x. But the reality is that our opponent is not going to have that many ace-x, right? If we look at our equity, 57, 56, yes, it's not great, but it's enough to bet for some equity denial, for some value. In terms of suits, what we can see is that apparently we prefer checking generally when we have a diamond. We'll talk about why. Now, this is less important, I would say, why the diamond prefers checking more. Even if you, for example, look on the AI version of the solver, it might say one blocker is better for one thing. Maybe if you try another solver, and the preferred blocker could be a different one. So it's not super, super important. But I would say this concept actually has some practicality, and it's relatively useful. So that's what our strategy is built on. Those overpair, well, now under pairs, and then the rest of the range just tags along, right? The hands are either going to bet small or check depending on those suits, blockers, etc., even if they are stronger. And then as for bluffs, generally out of position, the way you construct bluffing ranges is not by bluffing random hands. Like sometimes in position, you can actually bluff completely random hands. Generally out of position, we need something to latch onto, okay? So we could either have a draw, like gut shots, like open-enders, like flush draws, this sort of thing. And in terms of no draw, what we see is that we can have something like queen jack or jack 10, usually without diamonds. So what's the point of these hands? Well, the point of these hands is that they are very, very strongly blocking ace queen and ace jack, right? And those sorts of hands. And they don't block the diamond folds from our opponent. Like if our opponent floats the flop with king queen of diamonds, we are not blocking that with our hand. We are allowing him to have all of his folds. Okay. So, conclusions. Value thresholds start around where your peak starts, right? Where your range has a peak over your opponents. That's usually where the value range starts. Sizing is picked based on the equity of those peak hands and SPR, right? For example, if your quote-unquote peak hands are the nuts, on a very, very high SPR, the sizing is going to be huge, right? But when the SPR gets lower, it's naturally going to be smaller. Your peak / your opponent's valley is determined by both pre-flop ranges and then flop actions from both players, right? So from pre-flop, we can already have a bit of an idea, like, okay, small blind is going to have more kings, queens, maybe a little bit more of jacks, ace king, right? But the flop actions also define that peak and valley a lot harder, right? Because by betting big, we are really, really, really strongly saying that we have tens through kings, and by our opponent just calling, he's saying he doesn't have that hand as often, right? He would raise sometimes with those hands, etc. So the flop actions also define very, very strongly what those unique hands for each player are. And what we see is that traps share blockers with check fold. So the reason why in the solver the under pairs with the diamond are checking is because, again, it's not like a hugely important concept, but because the board had on flop 2 hearts and 1 diamond, our check folds on the turn are going to be hands with 2 diamonds. We're going to bet the flop with 2 diamond hands, over cards with the backdoor flush draw. And then on turn, we're going to check fold those hands, generally speaking. So paradoxically, our opponent is going to try to bluff us when he doesn't have diamonds. Right? When he has a low pocket pair without diamonds and this kind of stuff, or just when he has some like maybe king, queen with 1 heart and no diamond, he's going to try to bluff us, right? Whereas when he has 2 diamonds himself, he's going to try to give up more. So when we do have 1 diamond, it's a bit of a convoluted effect, but we are weighting our opponent more towards him bluffing rather than checking back. It's not super important, but it's a little bit of a cool idea. Okay, let's do another quiz. Small blind versus button through a pot once again, but now the board is different. Now we are on King 10 for two-tone. We are betting small, and we're getting called, and the Queen of Diamonds comes, completing the straight and the flush. Okay, what is going to be our betting frequency now? It's not about sizing, it's about frequency. And remember, try to figure out what our protagonist hands are, so to speak, and then how would you want to play those hands, generally speaking, right? What do we have a lot of that our opponent has less of, and how does that want to play? It's almost, in fact, a range check. And if we think about our protagonist hands, it's going to be fairly apparent why, right? Flushes are not really our unique hands, right? Our opponent has tons of flushes. Straights, maybe a little bit. We could have a little bit, maybe more ace jack, but in this Sims, ace jack offsuit is actually defending pre-flop for the button. So he actually has a very good amount of straights himself. He has a good amount of sets with tens, with fours. So in the nutted region, he has king queen offsuit himself, king 10 suited. So in the nutted region, we actually don't have much of an advantage. Our peak, if you will, is actually just fairly weak hands, like top pairs, right? Our peak is going to be more in just top pair region. So that is not, and like aces maybe, right? Aces, I guess, could bet, but theoretically, but our most of our protagonist hands are around the top pair region. So as we can see, there's a range bet on flop, 25%. And the Queen of Diamonds comes. Now we can see it's almost a range check. Let's see the range equity distribution, and let's look at the small blind. Do we have some small advantageous points? Yes, we have like this tiny spot right here, and then there's like this spot right here. Let's see what those hands are. Like maybe we have a little bit more king jack top pair with a straight draw and this type of stuff. But as you can see, comparing to the previous spot that we looked at, right? Remember the previous equity distribution we looked at? There was a very clearly big peak that our range had over our opponent, which drove the strategy, right? Here we don't really have a, if you will, a protagonist hand that wants to actually bet that much, right? We're betting a little bit with ace jack and whatnot, but mostly checking, right? So let's try some different turns and see what happens. So if the turn is a 2, right, now we're betting big, and we're betting quite often, right? Because if we look at the range distribution, we actually have a huge portion of hands that our range has more than our opponents, and those hands, like, you know, even under pairs to the king, like jacks, queens, but of course top pairs, they do bet. And we see even jacks and queens on this turn are just betting themselves. Okay. If we go to the previous example where we were on a 9-5-3 board and we bet big, we could also try some other turns and see what happens, right? We could try maybe E2, right? And here we're just going all in right away. Why? Right? Here our protagonist hands are unique, quote unquote unique. They're not really 100% unique, but let's just, for the purpose of simplicity, let's just call them unique. Are overpairs, right? And on this wet of a board, on a low SPR, 1.3 SPR, these hands want to just shove, right? So our overall strategy is built around shoves, right? So if you think about it, it all makes sense. You think about what your protagonist hands are on the turn, depending on what line you took, meaning what hands you have a lot more than your opponent, and then you build an overall strategy around those. Okay. Sometimes when you see the solver split into multiple sizings, what that means is that there are multiple poles in your strategy. There are multiple peaks at different points of the range that you can leverage. Now, in 3-bet pots, maybe it's not as common, but in single raise spot on much higher SPRs, you might have, for example, a peak in low pairs as the big blind and a peak in 2-pair plus in certain lines, but not a peak in top pair, let's say, for example. Right? So though that could mean you split into two separate sizings that are very far away, like block and overbet, for example. Right? That's where that comes from. Okay. And that could actually happen also in 3-bet pots as well, but not as much. Okay. So conclusions. Certain cards can increase or decrease the unique hands that can bet for value in a range, right? If a card helps us, for example, if an overcard came but not an ace, right? If a king or queen came, that is going to give us more top pairs than our opponent because he's not going to call random king X on flop or random queen X on flop. That's usually going to give us more value bettable hands that our opponent doesn't have as much of. That would increase our betting frequency by a lot, right? But when the queen of diamonds comes and the straight and the flush complete, a lot of our unique hands no longer want to bet, right? Our opponent now has flushes, has straights, etc., etc. So we have to be a lot more cautious with the center of our range, if you will. So this dictates betting frequency, right? How many unique hands we have that want to bet. Some extreme cases for high frequency would be polarizing on flop and hitting an overcard. For example, the ace, not so much because our opponent actually does float ace-X on flop, decent amount. But if it was a king or a queen, then we actually hit that much harder than our opponent. And we are now we have a much wider array of value bettable hands in our unique portion of the range. Another extreme case, but in the opposite direction, is the turn bringing a card that vastly devalues our unique hands, right? So the straight, the flush, etc. And if you think about it, a lot of the extreme cases will generally happen after you bet big on flop because it is a more extremely filtering action, right? It makes your range and your opponent range very, very, very different when you bet big on flop, right? So what you will see is usually if you bet small, it's rare that you will like range bet the turn on a certain good card, right? It's rare because even though your opponent's range filtered a little bit and your range maybe changed a little bit, it's not different enough to make you want to, go crazy with bets and whatnot. So usually after betting big on flop, a lot of more extreme things happen depending on the turn card that help you vastly or that help your opponent vastly. That could also be the case. Let's talk about some exploits when it comes to this concept of range peaks, range valleys, and unique hands and whatnot. So we've established that strategies are built around your unique hands. But if you think about it, that also means that they are built around attacking your opponent's valley or gap, right? When you have a lot of overpairs and your opponent doesn't, the strategy that you built is one that hurts all of the other hands in your opponent's range, right? If we bet big on 9-5-3 and then the ace comes and we bet small, our opponent would really, really want to have an underpair there to call our small bet, but he doesn't, right? When we bet big on 9-5-3 and then the turn is a brick and we bet big again, our opponent would really, really want to have an overpair there to just stack off, but he doesn't have those hands very, very often. So we not only use sizings that help our unique hands, our peak hands, we also end up using strategies that hurt our opponent's range because he doesn't have those hands that much, right? So that raises an exploitative idea, right? Basically, if our opponent has valleys that are not what the solver would have, right? If our opponent is missing hands that he should, in theory, have, we could use sizings and we could use strategies that attack that gap, right? We can adjust our turn strategy based on, for example, flop misplays. Not only flop misplays, it could be a pre-flop thing or whatever, but usually a flop misplay could make us want to play our range in a different way than what the solver does, right? So common examples are going to be, for example, raising too much on flop versus small bet, right? We bet small and our opponent raises too much, then on turn, after he just calls, right? It's a very difficult concept to apply because if someone raises too much on flop, we might have to exploit them after they don't raise. They just call. Maybe that's when we have to turn up the heat, right? Sometimes in poker, whenever your opponent is making a mistake, the way you attack it is not by waiting for them to make the same mistake. It's by attacking the rest of their actions, the rest of their ranges, right? Another common mistake could be betting too much when facing a check. So let's look at some of those examples and see if we can think about some exploits. So we could have, for example, let's say this particular board where we are going check on flop and a more or less a break comes, and we see the turn is splitting because we are attacking the under pair gap and we are attacking the very, very strong top pair gap, right? Because our opponent is betting most of these hands on flop. Now, we could do something like, for example, let's say our opponent just bets ace jack plus, right? He just bets ace jack plus on flop. And let's allow the solver to balance this out, right? So if we just no-lock these value hands and then we leave the rest of the range unlocked, the solver is going to try to balance bluffs with value. Okay, so let's allow the solver to add the proper amount of bluffs and just be more or less balanced in the betting range, but the checking range now is imbalanced. The checking range now is missing certain value hands that it should have, right? So even though the betting range is probably more or less balanced, we're not defending in a very, very strange way. The checking range, though, now is different. So on the same turn, on the 2, now we see a much higher betting frequency, of course. But let's try this split. Let's see what happens when we try to split with the same sizings as before, right? Now we are seeing a much higher frequency of the big bet, right? Of the small bet as well, but very, very striking how much the big bet has increased, right? Let's compare the strategy, not this one, but this one, right? It used to be betting big 13% of the time, now 28, more than double, right? And the small bet increased from 25 to 41, so a little bit less than double, okay? The reason why is if we look at the ranges now, well, now it's just absurd, right? And we have an insanely big peak around here, okay? So what this illustrates is that if your opponent is misplaying his range on flop, for example, by betting too much with value, or in some cases, we'll look at an example where he might raise too much with value, even if he's balancing the betting range, even if he's betting more with value and with bluffs, maybe his betting range is balanced, but that doesn't mean that his checking range is balanced, okay? So if your opponent is very aggressive, both with value and bluffs, and you don't know what to do, maybe you have to start thinking about attacking some other part of his strategy, okay? So let's look at another example. Let's look at a mono flop, for example. This is a very common thing that I see. So let's say we bet 10% flop. And let's say our opponent, instead of raising this amount, let's say he raises more. Okay? So let's say he raises a good portion of flushes. Let's say all these flushes, okay? Flushes and maybe a few sets, right? So we're making him raise flushes more and raise sets more. And he's balancing the rest of his range to bluff enough. So now if we face a raise, we're defending fairly reasonably, right? His betting range, or his raising range is relatively balanced. It's not terrible, right? Even though he's raising too much value, he's balancing it out with bluffs, so it's okay. But now there's another range that is in balance, which is the calling range. Okay, so what happens if we click call here? We're actually picking the big size, right? So let's try to compare what happens if we make this guy not raise those hands. So right now we see we're using a fairly big size. Let's see if it wants to split a smaller one as well, just to have a fair comparison. We'll look at the other simulator. Yeah, so about a 45% frequency and a lot of big size, some small size. And we can value bet queens. We can value bet even top pair. Now, I would expect, at least to some degree, that if we allow the solver to defend properly, the turn strategy should be at least slightly different. Okay, so now we see this is, by the way, the unlocked sim. This is the GTO line. In the GTO line, the solver is betting less frequently. Let's compare. In the GTO sim, the solver is betting this percentage of the time. Yeah, it's actually relatively comparable, but in frequency, but the sizing in the sim where we basically made our opponent raise the flop too, quote unquote, too thin, right? Now, when he calls, we can actually just leverage our nut advantage, right? In the regular sim, we don't have flushes as our protagonist hand because our opponent is just going to call flushes on flop. We don't have sets as our protagonist hand because our opponent is going to mostly call sets on the flop. But in the node lock sim, in the exploit sim that we created, we made our opponent raise flushes, raise sets on flop, and therefore now we have a wider array of unique hands that want to bet big, and those drive the strategy. And if you think about it, that's also attacking our opponent's gap. It's attacking our opponent's valley. So whenever you are on the turn, even to some extent on the flop, but on the turn is where these gaps start happening a little bit more strongly. Yes, you can think about how to build a GTO strategy and what the sizing would be and whatnot. But if you know what hand your opponent is missing in range that he should have, now you can use sizings with your overall range, and you can abuse those new unique hands that you have to attack his gap, to attack the hands that he doesn't have in range. Which side is locked is the right one. So the one that is betting big, the pink one, that is the locked one. You can see the little icon here that is locked. Okay, basically in the original sim, or I mean, I did first the node locked one and second the GTO one, but in the GTO sim, our opponent is calling the flop mostly, right? Remember, our opponent is mostly calling the flop with good hands. Sets are just calling most of the time. Flushes are mostly calling, right? But in the no lock sim that I created, he was raising basically always with sixes, threes, and a lot of flushes, right? So that is what's causing a change in the turn strategy. This is the GTO sim, just like a small, low frequency bet. Because why? Well, we were just attacking a gap in overpairs, right? In this configuration, after these flop actions, our protagonist hands are essentially overpairs, maybe some top pairs. But in the exploit sim that we forced our opponent to raise with flushes and sets, now our unique hands are something more than that. Now we have flushes and really, really strong hands as the drivers of our strategy. So it's not just about GTO, and it's not just about understanding how GTO builds strategies. It's also about understanding what your opponent's range is missing compared to you, right? What do you have that your opponent doesn't have? And that could be based on GTO, but very often it's just based on how your opponent plays. If your opponent plays differently, his gaps are going to be in different places. Okay, so to summarize, strategies are built around your peak or your opponent's gap, right? In the case of small blind versus button 3-bet pot, right? Very often that has to do with overpairs, that has to do with ace king, although not always. You have to look at the flop actions and see what both players are building their flop ranges around, what hands they are missing from their ranges, and that's going to, tell you what peaks and valleys there are in each range. So build on preflop and also on flop actions when talking about the turn. Size correlates with the equity of those unique hands, right? If your unique hands have 40% equity, then you might have check range. If your unique hands have 99% equity, then you're probably going to use a really big sizing. Frequency correlates with quantity, right? The betting frequency is based on how many value bettable hands you have that your opponent doesn't, right? If you both have value bettable hands at the same rate, especially out of position, that's usually going to mean your betting frequency is going to be very, very low, right? Your turn betting frequency is built around hands that you have that your opponent usually doesn't have that often, okay? And then if your opponent mistakenly constructs a big gap, right? If they have a gap that they shouldn't have in a certain portion of the range, you can attack it by changing your sizing and your frequency around attacking that gap and benefiting your newly, the unique hands that your opponent gave you by removing hands from his own range. So if you got any more questions, it's a very complex topic, make sure to ask them in chat or on Discord. And yeah, thank you for watching, guys. See you next time.